Hello, and welcome to today's lesson. We're going to be talking about properties of operations. So what that means is that we're going to be going over 6 properties such as commutative and distributive that tell us why we're allowed to do the steps that we do when we're solving equations. And so in understanding those can help you to know that you are doing the steps correctly when you are solving equations and not making a mistake. And then we're also going to look at order of operations and simplifying expressions. And so as we're going through these, make sure that you're getting the definitions down of these 6 properties and getting the steps of order of operations down in your notes so that you have those to look back at, to study, and reference when you're trying these problems on your own. So I'm so glad that you are joining us today, and let's go ahead and take some notes.
Here are the first 4 properties that you're going to need to know to answer these questions. We group the additive identity and multiplicative identity together to count as one. So the first one is the commutative property, which is where you change the orders of the addends or factors. So the 8 plus 8, the 8s would be the addends. 2 times 8, the 2 and the 8 would be the factors. And when you change the order of that, it doesn't change the sum or product. So 2 plus 8 is the same as 8 plus 2. 2 times 8 is the same as 8 times 2. That's the commutative property. The associative property is the order which numbers are grouped does not change the sum or product. So if you're multiplying 3 numbers, you can multiply the second and third number first, or you can multiply the first and second number first, and the third number second, and you're still going to get the same answer. And the same with addition. The distributive property is the product of a number and a sum is equal to the sum of the products of the addends in the number. So if you have a sum in parentheses with a number being multiplied out the side the parentheses, that's the same as taking the 2 numbers that are being added and multiplying both of them by that outside number. And then the identities, the additive identity is when you add 0 to an addend and the sum will equal the addend. So adding 0 doesn't change anything. That's the additive identity. The multiplicative identity is 1. If you multiply a factor by 1, the product will equal the factor. So that's just saying if you multiply by 1, that doesn't change anything. You're still going to end up with the same number that you started with. It's important that you have these done in your notes and that you memorize these vocabulary words so that you have these in your head. It will really help you to understand different questions when they're talking about these. The 2 of the first 4 that people get confused the most is the commutative property and the associative property. So here's just a little quick way on how to keep them straight. The commutative property is the switcheroo property. And it's saying no matter what order you multiply or add in, the product is or sum is always the same. The associative property is the friendship property. No matter how you group the numbers, the product is the same. So this is the one where you have 3 numbers and you're using parentheses to group them. Either the first and second get done first or the second and third get done first. And there's examples here on the sides. The next property you need to know is the inverse property. And the inverse property of addition is if you add a number and its opposite, so like 5 and negative 5, 2 and negative 2, 1/2 and negative 1/2, then you're always going to get 0. The inverse property of multiplication is if you multiply a number by its reciprocal, you're always going to get 1. So like 8 and 1/8. 10 times 1/10. 2/3 times 3/2. No matter you multiply those, it's always going to equal 1. The last property you need to know is just when sometimes you use a property to prove something and sometimes you're just performing an arithmetic fact. So when you perform, and this is when you perform a basic math fact involving two numbers. So all those facts that you memorize first through third grade. 2 plus 3, 9 plus 8, negative 7 times 6. Those are all arithmetic facts. So we're going to look at a bunch of questions where they give us a problem that's worked out in steps, and we have to tell why we are allowed, which property allows us to go from one step to another step. So this one says step 6. So it wants to know, why can we go from step 5 and end up with step 6? Why is step 6 allowed to happen? So if we go back to the step beforehand, we see that 9 plus 6 is being added in front of x, and then also 1 plus 8 is being added at the end to get 9. That's what happens between step 5 and step 6. Here, they're just adding two numbers together. They're performing a fact, so that's going to make our final answer an arithmetic fact, letter C. Now let's look at number 2, and it wants us to identify the property used in step 2. So I need to go from what happened from step 1 to step 2. What allows us to write step 2? So if I look, everything's the same except for the order of the addends is different in the parentheses here. So I changed the order in which I'm adding. The property that allows us to change the order that you're adding is the commutative property. So it's going to make my final answer D. This example here wants to know which property is illustrated in step 2. So if I look at step 1 to step 2, what has changed is 3.8 is being added first now instead of 1.6. These two flip the order that they're being added in. And once again, when you change the order you're adding two addends in, that's going to be the commutative property, which is step A. This question here asks, what is being illustrated in step 3? Which property? So if I look at step 3 and I look at step 2, the difference here is that this x has been factored out of these two terms. And the parentheses have been added. So when you take out an x, that's going to be the distributive property. It's just backwards from the way that we normally see it when we're solving problems, but you can do it both ways. Because if you distribute this x back out, that takes you back to where you began. Number 5 here wants to know which property is illustrated in step 1. So if I look at where we began and what I wrote next for step 1, I look and the parentheses are around the last two terms, so they're wanting to add the last two terms first, and then the parentheses are around the first two terms. They're wanting to add those two first. But because it's addition, it doesn't matter which order you added. So since I changed which two were grouped together to be added first, that's going to be the associative property, which is choice C. This question here wants us to identify the property used in step 4. So if I look at step 4, that's right here, and I go back, I'm looking at what changed from here, step 3 to step 4, and which property am I allowed to do that by. So if I looked in step 3, it took 12 plus a negative 12, and that became 0. So 12 plus negative 12, that's taking a number and adding its opposite and getting 0. When you do that, that's called the additive inverse, which you should have down in your notes, and that's choice A. This question wants to know which property is illustrated in step 1. So if I look at step 1 and what I'm originally given, I'm looking to see what changed. In step 1, the parentheses were removed from the original problem, and the 3.9 was multiplied by the x and by the 2.1. So since 3.9 was multiplied by both terms in the parentheses, the 3.9 was distributed, and so that's going to be the distributive property, and that's going to make letter A my final answer. This question here wants to know which property is illustrated in step 6. So I look at step 6, and I look at the one before it, and I see that the plus 0, the 0 plus 12 were added together to get 12, and that's what took me to step 6. So when I add 0 to anything and get itself, that's going to be the identity property, which makes D my final answer. For the next examples, we're going to be simplifying expressions, which means that we're going to need to review the order of operations. We have the order of operations is that we do parentheses first, then exponents, and then you multiply or divide from left to right, and then you add or subtract from left to right. And there's two common mnemonics that help us to remember these steps. The first one is please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So P is parentheses, E is exponents, multiply and divide left to right, add and subtract left to right. And the other one is just saying PEMDAS. The word stands for parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division left to right, and then addition and subtraction left to right. So you can just pick one that works for you, and that can be the way that you remember the order of operations. So here's an expression that we're going to simplify, and we're going to use that order of operations. So I went ahead and wrote down the acronym. So I'm going to do parentheses first. So it's going to be this 7 minus 5. So everything else in this expression will stay the same. I have 2 cubed plus 6, and 7 minus 5 is 2. And then I keep that divided by 4. And so now this parentheses doesn't have any operations left in it. It's just there to signify multiplication. So the next thing I'm going to do is exponents. So I have exponents here. Exponents is the small number written high. And 2 cubed, that means 2 times 2 times 2. So 2 times itself 3 times. Not 2 times 3. 2 times itself 3 times. Don't make that common mistake. And you can always use your calculator to check yourself. So 2 times 2 times 2 is going to be 8. And then once again, everything stays the same. I know it's tempting not to rewrite this all every time, but do it so that you don't make a silly mistake from trying to keep too much straight in your head. I see that all the time. The next thing you're going to look at is multiplication and division left to right. So here's multiplication and here's division. So I'm going to keep this 8 plus, and I do it left to right. So 6 times 2 is 12, divided by 4. And then 12 divided by 4 is 3. And I still have that 8 plus at the beginning. And then I do addition and subtraction left to right. And so here's my last addition. 8 plus 3 is 11. And that's going to be my final answer, which is B. Here's another expression we're going to simplify. So I already went ahead and wrote down the acronym for order of operations. Don't be afraid to do that at the top of your paper. So just to help you keep things straight, the more you write down and the less you're keeping straight in your head, the less likely you are to make mistakes. So we're going to start with P, which is parentheses. And so when I look at inside of that parentheses, I have both multiplication and an exponent. Well, exponent comes before multiplication in my acronym, so I'm going to do that exponent first. So that's going to be 4 cubed. So remember, that means 4 times 4 times 4, not 4 times 3. So 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. So I'm still going to have the 2 cubed plus in parentheses 8 times, and now that 4 cubed I'm writing as 64, in parentheses times 10 minus 26. And so I'm rewriting all of the numbers every single time so that I don't lose track of one, because these are long. It's easy to make a mistake. Don't just write down little bits here and there, because I see that all the time. Don't do that. So I'm still working inside of those parentheses. And now I'm going to do that multiplication. 8 times 64 is 512. And then I'm going to write everything down before and after it also. And so now the parentheses, there's no operations left in there. They're just showing multiplication now. So I move on to my next step, which is exponents. And here I have an exponent. It's 2 cubed. So that means 2 times 2 times 2, which is going to be 8. And then I copy down the rest of the problem, taking my time to do that. And now I'm looking at multiplication and division left to right. So here I have multiplication. 512 times 10 is 5,120. And I write down the rest of the problem that's left before and after it. And I don't have any more multiplication and division, so then I'm going to do addition and subtraction left and right. So first I'm going to do 8 plus 5,120, which is 5,128. And then I have the minus 26 still. When I do that last piece of subtraction, I have 5,102 as my final answer. So that's going to make B my final answer. And don't be afraid to use a calculator on any of these operations. The last expression that we're going to simplify has parentheses inside of the parentheses. So you work with the innermost parentheses first, and then you work out. So I'll show you what that looks like. And so I'm working with parentheses first. And so that means I'm going to work with these two inner parentheses first. So in this first one, I have just addition. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that addition. So I'm going to have 7, and then that squared still stays there. And the minus still stays there. And then in this next parentheses, I have an exponent and addition. So in my acronym, exponent comes before addition, so I do the exponent first. And that's 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9, plus the 4. And so then I just copy down everything else before and after the problem. And I keep working on those parentheses. So I have the innermost parenthesis to work on here. It just has addition now, so I'm going to do that addition, and that's going to be 13. And then I copy down everything else that's before and after it. And I still have parentheses left, but they're getting to be less and less. So inside of this parentheses, I have both an exponent again and subtraction. And once again, exponent is before subtraction, so I'm going to do this squaring first. 7 squared is 7 times 7, which is 49. And then I still have that minus 13, and I'm once again going to copy down everything that's before and after that I still have to work with. And now the parenthesis just has subtraction in it. So I can go ahead and do 49 minus 13, which is going to be 36. And then once again, I'm going to copy down everything that's before and after it. I don't have any operations left inside of my parentheses, so it's just showing subtraction now. So I now have E, which is exponents. I don't have any exponents left in this, so I don't need to do that step. Then I'm going to do multiplication and division left to right. I just have multiplication in this problem. So I'm going to do 5 times 36, which is 180. And I write down that minus 10 in front of it also. And then all I have left is subtraction. I do the addition and subtraction left to right. 10 minus 180 is negative 170, which is going to be my final answer, which is C. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you learned something new.